So, what are we doing today? It says it on the board, it's kind of obvious. We're going to talk about the foundational principles in the history of autonomous computing, or rather artificial intelligence. So, why talk about artificial intelligence? Well, that is my thing, more than anything else. Sure, I am the course leader on the games programming degree, but if you had to sit down and ask me why is it that I came in and started working as a lecturer and also a researcher in academia, it's because I spent 5 years of my life trying to figure out what the hell this is. I still don't really know. But to be fair, that's what most researchers will ever tell you, because part of what we're trying to do is continually discover and also improve upon the existing science. I've mentioned it before, but that is pretty much what I spent my life doing after I finished my bachelor's degree. I have a bachelor's degree in computer science, but I have a master's and a doctorate in artificial intelligence. And I focus particularly on video games. And in fact, if open to that, I'm happy to do a lecture on that subject. But I'm not really covering that today, because one of the things that really, to me, is that most people know what artificial intelligence is on a very light conceptual level, right? We all kind of know what it is. Well, because it's been around in science fiction for quite some time now, at least 50 years. But when you turn around to somebody who doesn't work in the field, who doesn't do anything to do with it, so what is artificial intelligence? They say, well, yeah, it typically involves robots or computers that think for themselves. And to an extent, that is correct. That is, in fact, right. We're a little bit fussy about when we say think for themselves, what does that actually mean? But yeah, they think for themselves. The other problem, though, is that everybody thinks that they've got a habit of being evil, and they've also got a habit of, wanting to destroy humanity. We haven't got there yet. I'm hopeful. Who knows? You see the opening of most of these science fiction movies where it shows you this dystopia, where artificial intelligence has ruled the world, and that's when I can sit back and go, well, at least I did my job right. So what I wanted to talk about today is really just, what is it? What artificial intelligence really is, but not going into it in a very kind of core technological sense, but talking about it kind of philosophically. I can do a technical lecture if you want. You're not ready for it, but we can look at it. Well, what is it? Where does it actually come from? And the fact of the matter is that we've actually been doing this a damn sight longer than you think. But what can we do already? And I don't go into that an awful lot today, but I really show you some of the research fields that exist. And if you think computing's big as a kind of field of craft, perhaps, or science, this is when you begin to look at just one topic and you see how big this is on its own. And this is when you realise that, yeah, spending 5 years studying it is still not enough to really grasp what we're doing. So, we often associate artificial intelligence more with the fiction than facts. That we're seeing all these science fiction stories where it's artificial intelligence plays some part in our society, either maintaining it or destroying it, right? So, AI-controlled societies, for example, iRobot is a good example of that. Where they have essentially permeated throughout our society to the point that they now govern it and we don't really think about it. The only reason they start to question it in that story is because the rules, Asimov's foundational rules, are being broken. And this was actually something that is kind of based on original science. The Asimov's theories were sort of, well, these are the 3 things that robots shouldn't do as an artificial intelligence. Because they were kind of thinking about it back in that day and going, well, what can they do? What will they be able to do? And how do we protect ourselves from it? And that was where all this kind of cool fiction came from. Societies where artificial intelligence is illegal, the remake of Battlestar Galactica did that, because the original Cylons that attacked them on Caprica were developed from artificial intelligence. They are then banned from developing further AI for fear of the reprisal of whatever system they build, having already seen what happened to them with the Cylons. Of course, subsequently the Cylons then destroy their home planet, and they go off on their own to try and find somewhere else to live, while they're being hunted by their own creations. The AI apocalypse, the Terminator's always an obvious one there. Skynet destroys the world, August 29th, 1997, around 4 p.m. Eastern Time, after he convinces Russia to nuke America, after America nukes Russia, because he's in control of the nuclear warheads. Brilliant. Whether or not AI systems are actually alive, do they have feelings, do they have rights? And also then subsequently the moral and ethical complications that arise when technology meets humanity. Possibly the best example, one of my favourites, is, despite not being a particular fan of the genre, I suppose, Ghost in the Shell standalone complex TV series. I can probably name you on probably 2 fingers my favourite anime series, and that is one of them. I don't particularly like anime, but I love that show, because it goes into such a rich detail about the society that emerges when we try to blend technology together, and subsequently the real issues as a race that we then face. From a video game perspective, Deus Ex, for those of you who have ever played it, is a fantastic example of that as well. So, I could go on for ages, and pretty much all of you will be able to find something on that board that you recognise. And I've kind of kept it fairly broad for those of you who ever actually did see 2001: A Space Odyssey, the likes of HAL, but we're going all the way through to Bender, Mega Man, Wally, Shodan from System Shock, the Geth from Mass Effect, that's specifically Legion that shows up in Mass Effect 2. You see it in movies as well, even like the likes of Jarvis in the Iron Man films, which is different from the comic books. It's still an artificially intelligent program. Claptrap from Borderlands, he's an AI. He's a bit erratic, but he's an AI. Looking at comic books, The Vision, who is actually created by Ultron, who is an evil artificial intelligence. And then also Danger, who is actually the physical manifestation of the X-Men's Danger Room, who tries to kill them. She's an artificial intelligence. She's got issues. She's got real issues. So, if you look at the broad range of them, they come in a whole bunch of different areas. What is their purpose? Protagonist, antagonist, kind of supporting character. And how they exist in conjunction with their creator, as it were, often varies. So we're seeing the likes of, even having Data and the Borg from Star Trek on the same screen. They are both artificially intelligent, sentient creatures, but they have a completely different perspective, which is actually driven by their creation. So, you guys kind of know all this. You've kind of seen all this sort of stuff before. So, well, how close does that actually match up? How close is that to reality? So, I thought, well, I'll talk about the most fundamental of principles. And it's actually quite straightforward. And you'll see that how many of these are very close to, but also not so close to what I'm about to cover. It's all about making intelligent decisions. That is the core tenet. And if you think about it, a lot of this actually comes from human psychology, behavioural psychology, specifically looking at action theory. Why do we do what we do? Why did you guys all get out of bed this morning? Why did you all come to this lecture, other than the fact that it was going to be awesome? I'm just going to cover in the next slide. What do you want to have for lunch? What am I going to do tonight when I go home? What video game am I going to play when I'm just kicking back at the end of the day? What drives any of these decisions that we make? There must be a reason that we do it. And it's simply because we are reward-driven creatures. We are actually quite greedy when you boil it down to our purest of essence. We want to be greedy. We are constantly seeking out reward. Reward that satisfies us on some level. So go looking at those examples I said there. I might do something cool if I get out of bed. I might go and work on an assignment. Well, why am I working on an assignment? Well, because there's a long-distance goal there if I want to finish my education and want to become a real boy. And potentially have a job in this area that I'm looking at. Alright, okay, that's why you got out of bed, cool. You don't think about it like that. You've kind of distilled it down in your mind that you know I need to get up because stuff needs done. I might learn something if I come to this lecture. I'm hoping that all of you that come to this lecture do learn something. But this is, well yeah, I need to go to the lecture because I'm going to learn stuff. Learn stuff helps me pass the education, get the degree, blah, 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 blah. You always see the kind of effect, the subsequent rewards that then accrue, even by doing the smallest of things. I like pizza. That's what I'm going to have for, my lunch because I dig pizza. Pizza's great. And pizza makes me happy, so I'm going to have pizza. It's actually a very funny reward because one, you get a full stomach, but two, you get the satisfaction from eating pizza. So the rewards can be immediate, like having pizza. They can also be long-term, like finishing this course and walking off into the great blue yonder as some wonderfully proficient graduate. There's also things, are they implicit or explicit? So, if it's implicit, for example, it might be that you've got the love and respect of another one. And you're like, oh cool, that's great, they love me, I love them. That's kind of a reward for you, and your actions can be driven by that. And that's kind of a weird part of this, which I'll cover in a second. But also explicit. Money. Why do we do most of the things we do? Because we're going to come here, we're going to get an education, so I'm going to get an education, then I've got a degree, I can go and get a really cool job, and go and work a really cool job. Why do I want a really cool job? Money! So I can buy stuff. And then I need more stuff. I got to keep working to get more money, buy stuff. Whether it's houses, games, whatever. Your priorities and what those things are will change as you get older. But not that quickly. I still haven't figured that out, I'm pushing 30. And we're all about just trying to maximise reward over time. We're very greedy like that. And it's funny because we've now tried to govern ourselves to a certain amount, because if we were just to run on our base instinct to maximise reward, we'd all try and kill each other. Because, you know, you have something I want. So we've tried to build kind of laws and morals and ethics around our decision making, so that, yeah, we'll still try and maximise our reward, and we might screw someone over, but we'll do it in the most ethically responsible way. That is how energy companies make their money. So, artificial intelligence in a nutshell, we're just trying to digitise that process. We're trying to make an intelligent decision. And it's based entirely on kind of philosophy. Which is why, interestingly, if you go to certain universities and study a degree in artificial intelligence, there's not many places that do it. You'll either get it as a science degree, or you'll get it as an arts degree. Because it's actually considered to be a humanities study. Because you're looking at philosophy and psychology to a certain extent, and it depends on how you teach it to you. Now, I was taught at the University of Edinburgh, which is probably the biggest and best artificial intelligence-based group within the UK, and they teach it as a science. However, we do get these sort of injections of kind of philosophy along the way, just as something to think about, and it's something that still to this day really gets to me, and I think about it an awful lot when I'm looking at problems and I'm looking at how we're actually achieving certain things, not just in terms of artificial intelligence solutions, but as a race as a whole. I actually am quite deep that way. But ethics is actually quite an issue. We don't talk about it in class. But it's one of these things that the longer you're in it and the more research you do in the area, ethics becomes a really big issue. And we're seeing this now to a certain extent with the likes of UAVs that are being developed by the American military, and they're now killing people in foreign countries. Where does the line end? Where does the buck end? Who is responsible for that death? Is it the system that's responsible for killing people? Well, it is actually capable of making its own decisions. It may have decided to kill someone, but we gave it that ability. So, does it stop with us as a designer? But then as a designer, you're not even thinking specifically of creating a killing machine. You're thinking of creating an intelligent piece of software. However, you can tailor it to work for the purpose of murder. Now, for a computer, that's not an issue, but for us, that is, because this is the clash, like I said before, about our morals and ethics that we've used to try and govern our reward structures. And I think we're hitting that problem now, and it's going to get worse. And we're going to see this probably in the next 10, 20 years as artificial intelligence becomes more pervasive in homes and in lives in general. Where does the buck end, and possibly legislation? Involves, yeah, there's always a human element to it. Yeah, and that's the thing, because can you really blame the designer for it? Because the person that subsequently took the original build, tailored it into a killing machine. But then can we condemn the scientists who actually built it? Or do we condemn the people who use it for that purpose?
Well, that's similar as saying, that's very similar to saying that Microsoft has built this program and somebody used to hack it into a back. That's similar to as that.
It's a gun.
So in a
Doesn't matter. Well, somebody murders something with a gun. You don't pull on the gun manufacturer, you pull on the guy that pulled the trigger. If we were doing that, then America would have a lot less problems. So, to really distill it down and actually talk at AI speak, it's all about agents. This is what we refer to when we're talking about artificial intelligence. We're talking about an agent, and it's typically a piece of software, and it has two key principles. It is rational and it is autonomous. What do I mean by that? Well, when I say autonomous, it makes the decision itself. It doesn't require our input. We've designed it such that it can behave on its own. What I mean by rational is that it's driven by all the existing knowledge and the goals that it has been given. We give it knowledge, or a system somewhere else gives it knowledge, excuse me, and it has some tasks that it wants to complete, a goal that it wants to achieve. And we have this expressed in such a fashion that the computer can understand it. And there's a whole research area in just trying to figure that bit out. That's a huge amount of work just trying to get that. So if you think about it, how do you turn something that you guys do every day in your life into a computationally tractable manner that a computer can understand it? This is why getting a computer to play games is such a big deal. And this is why we keep coming back to this. Not only just in terms of the pioneering of the science, but actually it's a whole research field in itself. That's where I spend a lot of my time. There's something really fascinating about trying to turn a game, whether it's chess, drafts, playing poker, playing a video game, how do you express that in a way that a computer understands it and can then act upon it? Coming up to that later on, we'll talk about that. What is quite fun though is that we strip away, like I said, this is potentially a problem. Morals, ethics, beliefs are not part of this process. Computers do not have morals, they do not have ethics, they don't have belief systems. And it's wonderful because they can achieve that which man cannot, rational decision making. There's this kind of delicious irony that it is built by possibly the most irrational biological entity on this planet. We are horrific. We kill people over the money in their pocket. We kill people over what version of the same God. We could be killing them because it's actually a different God. So that was Christianity, and then Christianity versus everybody else. Welcome to the Crusades. We kill people, we do horrible things to each other because we want to make a fast buck. We are driven by love, we are driven by hate, lust, revenge, desires, you name it. We're screwed as a race because we cannot make intelligent decisions. These things can. And it's this beautiful thing that we created something that surpasses us on so many levels. And this is why I have a very low opinion of the human race. It also drives my girlfriend nuts because I'm horrifically rational in arguments. I'm the worst person in the world to argue with because I don't argue back because I just don't see the point of losing my temper. And I've left that little quote at the bottom. This actually comes from Artificial Intelligence: A Modern Approach. Russell Norvig, 1995. This is pretty much the Bible of artificial intelligence for people starting out in the area. And like it says, it's extended from the Latin agere, which is to do. And it's really just trying to take enough information it knows, and then what it thinks is the best possible outcome. Not necessarily the right thing to do, because then of course you're implying morals and ethics. What is the best thing for it to do in terms of accruing reward? So I was trying to think off the top of my head. Right, so AI is actually a really big area. So I crunched this slide out in about 45 seconds. No, maybe a little bit longer than that, because I don't take that fast. Maybe about a minute and a half before, literally about 15 minutes before I came here. So I thought, I don't have a slide like this. That's just what I pulled off the top of my head. This is different areas that we work in. And you can see even a large problem like natural language processing, which we do this, we're able to listen to human speech, translate it and understand it so a computer can respond to it. There's so many different subfields. Personally, I've worked in the area of description logics, probabilistic reasoning, game tree search, heuristics, a little bit of motion control. I've done a lot of machine learning, reinforcement learning, generic algorithms, simulated annealing. I've worked in planning and scheduling, generation, heuristic, execution monitoring. There's so much. I think I could probably do an entire lecture just doing slides like that. That's how big this is. And we've been doing it for so freaking long now that there's almost a problem that when we come out, originally when artificial intelligence got to the point it could be applied, we said we had this noble goal of achieving human decision making in a machine. It's now exploded far beyond that, that potentially the original goal has been lost. Because to a certain extent that's not what we want. We want something better than a human. Like I pointed out, humans are kind of flawed. And we keep finding all these different areas that we can explore, and they keep coming up more and more, again and again and again. This is my new thing right now. Distributed artificial intelligence. We've now got cloud-based computing. We've got massive systems that can talk to one another. How can we propagate information and do some really cool stuff with that, and potentially destroy the world in the long run? So, let's see. I'm going to do a little bit of history, flash through of history. You're going to see a bit of an overlap with some of the history of comp sci that Wayne did, but not much. You're going to see that I actually go in a slightly different direction from him. So, question time. Give me a rough guess. Who thinks they know roughly when the first ever piece of research that could be considered artificial intelligence was conducted?
1920s, 1800s.
Ancient Greece?
Not bad. Well, definitely pre-20th century. We only started applying it in the 20th century.
1800s.
I'm going to go with one that I already heard. The very first recorded started research on artificial intelligence was actually referred to as the mechanization of thought. And it was conducted by some guy called Aristotle, 350 BC. He actually did work on how to digitize the thought process. How could you, create some sort of mechanical approach to thinking like a human? Now, of course, he didn't get very far with it. It's not like there was AI robots wandering around in, ancient pre-Christ times. But, they were actually thinking about this sort of thing back then. And it's staggering when you actually see there's a lot of research that was conducted throughout, ever since Aristotle's first ideas. That we've been thinking about this a lot longer before we even actually figured out how to do computers in general. It was only really, and you'll see this in a second, when we got to the late 19th century, we went, hey, now we can do this. Another one, Raymond Lull. Now, he actually developed machinery to work on a very basic logic computation. He made the Lull circle, or the Lull wheel. And what it was two pieces of paper with characters on them, and depending on how you rotated them, he could actually create logical expressions to a certain extent. The idea being that he could express the truth of those wheels, and essentially having some sort of symbolic notation. Now, of course, he actually did that in the 1300s. So he was a wee bit ahead of everybody else. Gottfried Leibniz, who was actually a mathematician, he developed his symbolic logic, which is called the Begerschrift, which is German for, roughly, concept script. And he was inspired heavily by what Lull had done, and actually then made his own Leibniz wheel. He actually created the first ever mechanical calculator, because he's trying to figure out, how do I turn something logic into a mathematical, computational, mechanical form that I can get something else to do it for me rather than doing it in my head. And that's actually a sort of a reproduction of one of his wheels that he built. It was hand cranked, but it worked. He actually got it to work. And he did that in the late 17th century. The interesting thing is that Gottfried Leibniz is potentially the first ever computer scientist before anybody else, because he actually came up with the theories of computation and logic. He also did it 200 years before anyone thought about it, and we didn't know. Leibniz, his work on symbolic logic, he actually came up with the ideas of empty sets, identities. We talked about conjunctions, disjunctions, inversions, in kind of simple logic. He came up with this idea way before the next person that came along, who suggested it in the mid-1800s. Of course, the thing is, Leibniz that wasn't actually his main thing. This was just something he was just mucking about with in his spare time. It was a side project. He never published it. They didn't find his work on this area until 20 years after somebody, 20 years after somebody else said, here's our idea for formal logic. And that guy suggested formal logic 180 years after he did. That's ridiculous. We didn't even know. We've still never found all of Leibniz's work. He never actually published it. It's just lying around in scraps of paper. And you read this and go, holy crap, this guy was a genius. It's so far ahead of anything else that was going on. So it's kind of maddening. I mean, when we started getting towards the 19th century, that was when computer science was really beginning to be established. And this whole idea of this whole mechanization of our thought, well, we could actually do that. This wasn't just a case of instruction, which is what computing was all about, getting instructions, processing instructions. We wanted to create human-like decision-making. But we were thinking, computers, cool, these computer things have come up, awesome. I mean, Babbage came up with his analytical engine. It was ideal in theory, and to the point that Ada Lovelace, who won the Ada programming language is named after her, she's also arguably the first ever computer programmer. Suggested, she even gave examples of how you could use Babbage's system that was never built to create AI for games. She talked about playing chess on it and having the computer give you chess moves. What the heck? So, one person that was actually very big on this was Alan Turing. Now, Turing we've heard a little bit about before he developed the Turing machine. He's actually quite a big influence on artificial intelligence in general. Much like everything else he did, he was actually probably 20 or 30 years ahead of most other people he was talking to. He came up with the notion of the Turing test, about how we can actually have artificial intelligence that mimics human-like behaviour to the point that we think it is acting like a human, or at least can fool us into thinking it's human. This is still used to this day. There are still annual Turing test competitions to see how close we're getting. We're getting there. We're still a long way away from ever actually achieving it. But a lot of his foundational principles and theories on how we perceive artificial intelligence was then solidified probably about 40 years later. He actually worked off work that Claude Shannon had done. I think it was the late 1930s. Claude Shannon had published a paper talking about the theory of how you actually could write a chess program before we had a computer that could write a chess program. So, what Turing did was he actually ran the first ever AI versus human chess game. Good, but he couldn't actually run it because no computer was built to support it yet. So he did it all by hand. He actually sat down with Shannon's algorithm and implemented it on a bit of paper. It took him about 30 minutes per move to figure it out. I think he still won, but the principles of actually developing a system that could learn, or at least observe what was happening in a game world and acting upon it, well, oh man, this is amazing. Nobody could actually do it. Of course, the problem is that, as was already kind of pointed out in the history of computer science, is that we didn't really give Turing much credit at the time. For a number of reasons. Well, obviously he was part of the Enigma project. He was fighting against the Nazis in World War II. And an awful lot of what he did is actually top secret until only, a couple of decades ago. Because the government locked that information down. And interestingly, he was one of the first people ever to see if you could write a computer program that can play Monopoly. Which is why you can buy an Alan Turing edition of Monopoly. It's limited edition, you can only get it from Bletchley Park, where the Enigma project was held. It's a project sponsored by Google. I'm lucky enough to own one of the first 200 copies of it they ever actually made. Not yet. Nobody wants to play Monopoly, you see. And interestingly, he thought he could turn it into an algorithm that he could then play Monopoly and beat a child who was actually the son of another researcher who was based at Bletchley Park. He failed miserably. His algorithm was actually crap. But the mere notion that he even thought he could do it, and it was one of these things that he just scribbled about. It was never formally published. The other problem is that he was gay. And as we know, gay people, particularly back in the 1940s and 50s, was somewhat frowned upon. So he was pretty much ostracized in the scientific community. And we were not allowed, essentially his theories already were considered occasionally to be a bit of a crackpot. Even his theories on computation and how computers should work sort of went against the grain of how things were at the time. He said, not only are you nuts, but you're gay. So you're probably nuts because you're gay. And he was he was a proud gay man, he was happy to admit that. And then of course that caused a problem because it was illegal. The man was chemically castrated and humiliated. His research was completely ignored. And subsequently, we believe he took his own life. We don't really know, but that's what we believe. And the mad thing is that only about 20 years after his death, everyone sat down and looked at his work and went, oh shit, that guy was onto something. To the point that we now consider him to be the godfather of what is now modern applied artificial intelligence. So, to kind of rush through the remainder of the 20th century, which is actually when we started applying it. This is when we started doing things. At Manchester University in the early 1950s, they actually built the first ever game AI that could give you an answer to playing drafts of chess against a human being. Of course, this is back in the days when those machines were actually the length of a wall, or 3 walls, but they actually developed something that could work. In the 1960s, we saw the likes of Larry Fogel came up with the notion of evolutionary-inspired artificial intelligence. Systems that, based on some DNA-style representation, can evolve and learn to do stuff. In fact, that was my honours dissertation. It's the first time I ever saw this, because I actually developed a little system that learns to play a game. It was quite pronounced now. STRIPS, which was the Stanford Research Institute planning system, they developed a symbolic logic for being able to express high-level information and create plans of execution. Pretty much every robot that now gets sent to space by NASA runs off the principles of those systems. What then became really interesting was in the 1970s we had what was called the first ever AI winter. And it's because people that own budgets are kind of morons. So these researchers in the 40s, 50s, 60s said, look, dude, I got a great idea, right? I'm going to create a computer that can do stuff itself. It's going to think up cool ideas, it's going to execute ideas, it's going to be epic. We need a couple of bajillion dollars to work on this project. Government people here, evil robot armies. I'm kind of paraphrasing a little bit, but that's kind of what they were looking for. Evil supercomputers, evil robot armies. So we got to the 70s and they said, dude, where's our armies? I'm not getting evil robots yet. Why have I not got a supercomputer that can run my house for me yet? Where's all this money going? Well, it's taken us a lot longer than we actually thought. We've just sort of realised this AI thing's actually really hard. The computers aren't there yet. We're actually suffering from real hardware issues. The systems are not advanced enough. So a lot of the money got pulled, and a lot of seminal work that was conducted in the 60s didn't get much love in the 70s. They stopped funding it. And people would go off and do other things. Sometimes they managed to keep their money and kept going. But we then had this weird wave in the 80s where expert knowledge systems crept up. Expert systems where, particularly the prominence of languages such as Prolog, logic-based languages where you can infer information based on information you already have. So, that was kind of a big boom that came along. But the dot-com boom, it's like expert systems, way! And then that died a death, which then caused another AI winter. But right around that time, we were actually beginning to work on robotics. There's actually quite a prolific researcher who's now based in Sheffield, Noel Sharkey, who came in from a philosophy background and decided that he wanted to work in robotics. He actually became right fascinated with the notion of robots that could execute their own behaviour. Having no background at all as a computer scientist, he didn't know anything about computing. He was a philosopher, a psychologist, so he kind of focused in those kind of areas. And then he learned to become a computer scientist. He's now actually one of the most prolific researchers of the 1980s, particularly looking at artificial neural network research and how you can use that to create essentially simulated brains for robots. And we still do this research to this day. Also, the likes of Rodney Brooks in the 1980s had started working more heavily on modular robotic systems and creating robots that you could decouple their behaviours into separate components and then trying to do it sort of like a Lego project. We're going to have this bit of smarts and this bit of brains and this bit of brains. And to a certain extent, he was right. And my God, did he milk it. That guy made a career out of that. He really did. In fact, he still rides off the success of that work. The 1990s is really when the notion of intelligent agents really we sat down as a community and went, right, what is it we're doing? Intelligent agents, right? That is it, okay? Let's make sure we're all just kind of sitting on the same starting point, so we're not all over the place and we don't really understand what each other's doing. We're talking about intelligent agents, that's it. Also, this is when IBM's Deep Blue came along. This is the first ever computer system that could beat a human being, or a human chess grandmaster. I think of chess, obviously. Played against Gary Kasparov. It's quite interesting that Deep Blue, despite being hailed as this wonderful marvel of artificial intelligence, isn't really. It is I say this almost kind of insultingly, and I don't mean it as such, but it is an optimized piece of hardware that is remarkably good at looking up databases. That's what it did. It crunched through database records to come up with optimal moves. Remarkably powerful. It was an insanely powerful piece of tech at its time. It was a supercomputer that was deliberately optimized to play chess. And there's often a lot of debate over whether or not it did succeed in beating Kasparov. The argument is it did, but Kasparov's always suggested that they were going funny business in the background. No. There's also... He did get another round back. Because it's been suggested that people were actually cheating the code when he was playing it. The other one that came along is Chinook, which was the first ever super powerful AI drafts or checkers player. That still holds as I recall, still holds the title of being the best drafts player in the world. Sadly, we don't entirely know whether or not it is. I forget the name of the guy who was at that point the drafts champion of the world. sadly, I mean, they were actually in the middle of a multi-game series, and it seemed almost neck and neck. The AI kind of got a bit of a head start on him, and sadly he actually died of health complications. So we don't really know. I mean, it ended up the AI won by default, because it's living and he's not, but we don't really know whether or not it could have succeeded, and it was a really exciting thing to see. Actually, speaking of that, we actually solved drafts, which sounds ridiculous when you think about it. This research was conducted around 2005, 2006. It is now mathematically proven if you play the best possible game of drafts you can possibly play, you play the best possible game of drafts you can possibly play, it's a draw. Doesn't sound that exciting, does it? I don't know about that. That's much easier to solve. But the fact that you can mathematically prove that is insane. It took them months to come up with a computer that could actually do it. It had to sit and crunch numbers for months and months. It took something like 9 months to actually come up with the final proof to say, yeah, okay, we can actually, it's a draw. And of course, it's funny when you talk to certain people, because you talk to people who don't really do AI, and they go, it's a draw. Oh, okay. You tell it in front of an AI community, they go, what? Oh! We actually figured that out! We're not going to solve chess anytime soon. And I might actually cover that in another lecture as to why. Because chess is a damn sight bigger than drafts will ever be. Also, one of the more recent ones, which was really exciting, is IBM's Watson, which was a suite of hardware that it runs on case-based reasoning systems, and it's also plugged into the internet. This thing can play Jeopardy. And in fact, there were several episodes of Jeopardy that took place at IBM's main research centre in America, where it played against two of the highest scoring Jeopardy players of all time. And it beat them. It can actually win a game show. And most recently, even within the last couple of weeks, it's now been revealed they've had it working on medical diagnosis. This thing can actually now diagnose medical issues that people have and suggest acts of, how to actually resolve these issues. And it's merely because it's pulled so much information off the internet and it actually absorbs it, collates it, and tries to understand it. Watson itself is probably about the size of this room. That's how big it is. And it's just nothing but racks of servers, and they all communicate with one another. It's a really fascinating piece of work. If you actually go onto Google, YouTube specifically, you can watch Watson playing Jeopardy. It's a pretty cool thing to check out. So, talking about kind of science towards fiction, and I thought I'd do this just for a bit of fun, is like, well, if I go back and look at those examples from earlier, and think about these principles, it's rational, it's autonomous, it makes reward-driven decisions, it acts based on information it has, it's not driven by impulse or emotion, and look at all these again. Can you think of a good example? Which of these do you think, going back on it, you go, you know what, dude, I'm a massive Star Trek fan. I'm not, but you might. Is any of these actually, like this data or the Borg, like a good example of what we actually consider from a scientific perspective to be an artificial intelligence? Likewise, with, say, the likes of Mega Man, GLaDOS, Skynet in general, even the Cylons or even Bishop, what have you, from Aliens. Can you think of one? Now, I often think about this far too much. Whenever I watch any sort of video game, I read a book, I watch a movie, there's an AI in it. Remember, like, you're probably these people that when you sit and watch anything where they're going, hacking into the computer, and you're watching it going, I'm the guy that's when the AI turns up. I go, like my girlfriend, for example, she used to watch a lot of CSI. And of course, whenever there's any sort of medical or biological thing, she comes from a biology background, she goes, that's a load of rubbish. Has anyone ever seen the show Numbers? Show of hands, anyone seen Numbers? Okay. Numbers is essentially to computer scientists what CSI is to biologists. That's the one show where you sit there and go, really? Really? It really hacks me off. So, if I was going to think of a good example, and I'm going to bring it up now, it would probably be this. Drum roll. Oh, okay, well you can give me a literal drum roll if you want. Hang on a second, there's an advert on YouTube. Just keep that drum roll going.
machine wrapped in flesh. Kills, but cannot be killed. Arnold Schwarzenegger is Terminator. An assassin from the 21st century, sent back through time. His target is a woman who holds the key to the future. Her only hope is a soldier who has hunted the Terminator from the future into the present.
Not a man. Machine. Terminator.
What does it really mean?
It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear. And absolutely will not stop. Ever. Until you are dead.
Arnold Schwarzenegger in Terminator. Terminator.
Don't you love old 80s movie trailers? They're so bad. So, yeah, actually, the Terminator. Now this isn't because, as the guys who went to the game jam last weekend know, I have a bit of an infatuation with Arnold Schwarzenegger movies. In fact, I was blessed in getting the chance to see the Terminator movies, particularly the first and second one, when I was about the age of 10. You might say that actually my dad was a horrible person, but he watched them with me because I was like, I want to look after you, but I still love these movies, so I'm going to watch them with my kid because I'm a great dad. My dad is awesome. Has anybody here never seen any of the Terminator films? Wow. Okay, I would encourage you to go and see the first two. Don't bother with the third one. By God, avoid the fourth one like the plague. And I'm actually kind of a fan of the Terminator Sarah Connor Chronicles TV series. I thought that wasn't as bad. But yes, the first two, the ones that James Cameron, the guy who actually invented Terminator, directed it, are very good for this. And it's funny because actually, to be truthful, this is actually quite a frightening thing for my friends. For many people who know me, I've always loved the early Terminator movies. To the point that I am now an artificial intelligence researcher and a doctor in that area. And I actually work in the same field that the Terminator was actually devised from. So I'm often referred to as Dyson by my friends. Periodically they threaten that they will one day travel back in time and kill me. So the mere notion that somebody who was obsessed with these films as a teenager now actually works in this area, it's kind of crazy, but it's my feel-good story. Why the Terminator? Well, that's what it says. It's an entirely objective automaton. The Terminator is actually quite a bland character, because all it does is it sets out to do its job. It's hunting down Sarah Connor, or in the case of the second one, they're trying to kill John Connor, who's her son. I'm not going to go into this in much detail for fear that any of the three of you who've never seen it. There's a huge spoiler in the second one. I'm not going to talk about it, okay? But it realises also when to attack and when to lay low. So it's trying to devise its plan of attack. It learns an awful lot about its environment. The first thing about the Terminators is that nothing dead will go through the time portal from the future. So they have to wrap it in flesh. That is why the Terminators look human. It also works as an added benefit because we didn't have the budget then for robots. But the fact that it can then blend into society. The first thing it then does is it mugs someone for clothing. It tries to find a vehicle. It's trying to figure out how to solve its task in the most efficient manner possible. So it's actually going through the system and going, right, how do I go about this? I need clothes, I need a vehicle. Okay, I need to figure out where Sarah Connor is. It mugs the guy at the phone booth. It takes a phone book because it has addresses in it. It systematically works its way through the address book and starts killing all the Sarah Connors in the address book. It's got a plan of attack. It's revalidating itself. After it attacks her in Tech Noir, and Kyle Reese helps her, it then retreats. Because not only has it been damaged, it's going up against a large number of policemen that are ready for it. So it goes home, it repairs itself to a certain extent, preps its attack again, knowing full well she's now in the police station, assaults the police station and kills every single police officer in there. It's actually got a particular plan of attack. It occasionally has an issue with calculating risk, particularly if you think about how they all die. Spoiler. maybe they don't quite think it through, but at the same time it's made from a titanium alloy. What's really the thing, and I picked up a trailer to express it, is there's that quote from Kyle Reese when they're in the car park hiding from it not long after it first attacks Sarah Connor. And he says to her, look, listen and understand, that Terminator is out there. It can't be bargained with, it can't be reasoned with, it doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear, and it absolutely will not stop ever until you are dead. As horrible as that sounds, that is pretty much the clinical definition of a true artificial intelligence. Because it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do, and it's not going to stop and rethink what it's doing unless there's a really good reason for it. You're not going to be able to convince this guy not to kill you, because that's his job. And that, to me, that is why I love it still to this day, is that the more I read into it, and also the fact that Skynet and the Terminator is built off neural net processors, where they were trying to build CPUs that are inspired by neural net technology, which exists. They actually did research on what was big and upcoming research at the time. People are working in neural nets for robotics. We're going to base the Terminator on neural nets. I've worked on neural net research, so I kind of feel as if I'm contributing to the cause. You know, it's kind of exciting that way. So, at the risk of being controversial, because I know this one's going to piss off a couple of people.
Just one question on that.
Yep.
You can argue there's a decision made by the Terminator at some point in the second film that is based on emotion.
Which one?
Oh, what, the TA?
Then that's an operational mandate. It's been told that once its goal of actually doing the first thing, which was ensuring that the child survives, its next goal was to do that. That's not an emotional response, that's actually ensuring the preservation of the timeline.
No, but he delivers a line to John Connor, and I know what you mean.
But it's also, if you think about it, it's actually quite clinical in its response. I can't do it. I get why you do it, I just can't. And of course, it sounds really emotional, it could actually be very clinical. It does learn in the second one, the Terminator does learn in the second film, because it's, if you remember that in the first one, it's only operating based on some logic it's already got prescribed. In the second one, it realises that it can learn new things, because they aren't allowed to learn when they go out in the field. So when they reset it... Sorry? No, it's just got the metal, it's got the flesh surrounding the metal inside it, it's just a robot underneath.
I thought it was like in the first one how you could easily tell.
Because in the 700 series had rubber skin, we spotted them easy, but these are new.
That's why they need the dogs to tell whether they're...
That's why there's dogs in the future, because they can smell them. Don't spoil it for the rest of the audience who've never seen the second one. God, what are you like? Right, going to get to this. The bad ones. What is a bad example of artificial intelligence? And this is going to piss people off. GLaDOS. Yeah. It has a personality overload. It has passive-aggressive tendencies. It also doesn't seem to decide on what it wants. It has a continued issue of conflicts of needs versus wants. And of course, AIs don't have needs. Part of the story is that it gets conflicted with a personality component. And there's the personality components are conflicted with its operational components, and it's causing it problems. This is why GLaDOS goes a little bit crazy. There's something kind of almost relatable about the character, and I kind of dig that to a certain extent. It's just as psychotic as like HAL from 2001: A Space Odyssey, but HAL is far more clinical because it's not actually a cycle. It's actually just going by in a very rational manner if you really think about it. GLaDOS I can't figure out, and I go back and play Portal a couple of times just to kind of answer why. But one of the things that does come up, which I really have been thinking about ever since I played it, and I'm probably going to write an article on my website soon about it. It's got me thinking that can an artificial intelligence actually have a narcissistic personality disorder? Now, if you think about it, narcissism is all about it's essentially a very kind of self-deprecating, negative way of self-improvement. Well, that's kind of what an artificial intelligence is all about, is achieving optimality. So, wouldn't an AI that's got some element of self-reflection also be narcissistic? Because it wants to become better than it actually is, to continually improve its decision-making process. And that's been bugging me ever since I had that thought a little while ago, that it's probably fair game for it to have characteristics in its behaviour. And I'd say that is actually fair to say. Personality is something else. And it's bugging me. I'm going to have to go back and think about it another time. So, this is audience participation time. Yay! As we are about to wrap up. If I was to bring up one of these, would you say that it is a true artificial intelligence, going by what I've just described today? No. Why is it not artificial? Is it? It's a robot. It is a robot. It's a robot.
We have morals.
Made out of metal. What organic part exists in Optimus Prime? At what point has he got any organic components? He's made of metal, therefore by definition he's not organic. Optimus Prime, not the Matrix. The Matrix is a secondary thing. I like this. We're getting into controversy and I'm only on the first image. I got like another 8. But he does take it out.
It's not in this. You take it out.
Right, flame war outside, okay? Alright. Bishop from Aliens. And then of course that also extends probably to the robot that also exists in the first Alien film as well. What do you think? Yeah, I would say that. They actually are programmed to have bad objectives. They're morally and ethically wrong, but they're trying to resolve whatever it was that they were set out to do. Now, he's actually sort of a goodie, isn't he? You think you're kind of worried about him the whole time because, spoilers, the one in the first movie is actually quite evil. Sorry. If you've not seen the first two Terminators, the first two Alien films at this stage in your life, there's actually something else that's a bigger problem. That could be another lecture in itself. How to reach this stage in your life through cinema, you know? So I'd probably say Bishop is actually a good example of it because he does adhere to these principles. And he's actually trying to be a good guy, but the problem is nobody trusts him. So following that, David from the somewhat controversial Prometheus. I love his portrayal in that movie. There's something fascinating about what he's trying to do, and I'm going to essentially answer that question for you. I think he is. But what he's doing is he's on a continued learning curve. Because he's trying to figure out how to behave human. So we're in this problem right now where we want our robots to look and act like us. And there's even a line in the movie where they talk about it, where they go out into a harsh environment with no air, and he wears the full suit. And they say to him, why do you put on the suit? Because you don't need air. And he said, well, I've been designed to look, act, and behave just like you people because you freak out when we don't build something that looks like you. And it's a very valid point. And I thought Michael Fassbender's performance in that movie was just wonderful. The Geth from Mass Effect. Yeah, very much so. They are operating on a mandate. They are here to pretty much wipe out all life in the galaxy. Well, all the entire universe, really. I won't go into it for much more. And also because I've still not finished Mass Effect 3, so keep it to yourself. Mega Man. Yes, in a way.
Yeah, because he just does his objective.
Now, this is actually depending on your definition of Mega Man's background. Because there's also the controversy of Mega Man X. Because according to the original canon, whichever canon that might be, because there's two different definitions of Mega Man's canon. One they retcon halfway through the original Mega Man games, is he isn't, X isn't, but he is. Because X is now actually capable of making decisions for himself. That is why Dr. Light incubates him for God knows how long after his death, and then he's revived during the Maverick Wars. The original Mega Man is actually meant to be a robot who's essentially Dr. White's little prince. However, that's kind of controversial because the original story of Mega Man was that he was somebody who was driven by revenge after his wife was killed and turned himself into a cyborg. Who knows? The Cylons from Battlestar Galactica.
Nah.
Without risking spoiling pretty much anything from about season 3 onwards in Battlestar Galactica remake, I don't know. They get a bit funky towards the end of that show. Wall-E. I think Wall-E is is actually a good AI for about the first 10 minutes. And the very last bit, don't spoil it. There's a whole bit in the middle where he becomes infatuated with Evie, and there's no reason for it. So, don't get me wrong, I freaking love that film, but I just sit there and go, this just isn't right. He's not going to fall in love. What's that all about? It's weird. Shodan from System Shock, for those of you who actually remember it.
If you essentially the other goddess, you believe she passes humanity. But it's more emotional, so you think she's a bit superior.
Yeah, this is the thing about the narcissism. Again, I've been thinking about this because I'm not decided on Shodan. Shodan is gloriously evil in her behaviour, but when you actually distill it down to the purest essence of the action she's creating, is it actually just part of how she expresses it to the player to scare you, versus is it as a decision making being driven by emotion? I'm going to have to go and play System Shock 2 again. Tragic that is. So, there's your homework. Next time you're reading a book or a comic book, you're watching a movie, you're gaming, and you see an AI character, does it act rationally? You know, is its rationality actually being based upon what it knows, where it is, and what its goals are? Now, before you all go, lastly, there are some future lectures we can do on this, actually looking at it from a technological perspective and gaming AI and examples in the industry. Topic 1, show of hands. Some people kind of interested. Topic 2, show of hands. Okay then, that looks like the lecture I'm doing next. Thank you.